and the audio and slides from today will be made available on the FPRINZ website tomorrow. I will also send out the slides and the link to the recording via email. After the webinar, a short survey will pop up. If you could please take a moment to fill this out, as we greatly appreciate your feedback on these webinars. So Catherine is an international public relations consultant, educator and writer. She heads PR Knowledge Hub Limited, which offers and delivers online and face-to-face development programs. A FPRINZ Fellow, a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, and a Chartered Public Relations Practitioner, Catherine facilitates many of the FPRINZ courses and is responsible for designing and developing the FPRINZ River Continuing Professional Development Program. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Catherine Arrow to speak about why measurement matters.
Thank you, Rihanna. It's lovely to have the opportunity to talk with you today around measurement and evaluation, which is a bit of a soapbox of mine. The very first time I ever got into trouble at a consultancy was when somebody came in and brought AVE measures, which was advertising value equivalent measures, to the table to show the client. And I queried it and said, why are we looking at this? This doesn't make any sense. This isn't a real figure. This isn't fair on the client. And I did get into all sorts of trouble. But fortunately, after that, we did change the way that measurement and evaluation was undertaken in that particular workplace. So I hope that you're sitting comfortably with a coffee or another nice hot lunchtime beverage. And when we talk about measurement and evaluation, you have to add research, measurement and evaluation to it, because the three things really do work together. And here we go. Sometimes, as I mentioned, measurement really does get me wild. So this webinar is a short exploration of some of the myths that have dogged PR and communications for far, far too long. It's had a murky past. I know for decades we've been haunted by the whole question of advertising value equivalence, and we'll look at those as we go. They are being and have been discredited for a long time, but they still pop up. They really do still pop up, and it's a real shame. Measurement is also regularly identified as a skills gap for the profession, and it generally appears alongside digital and visual communication. And after many decades as a practitioner, I can honestly say that it's one area of work that tends to be the most botched. People don't know really where to start, how to report, and how to present the value of the work that we do. And the value of the work that we do is significant and important, and it's worth taking the time and, when necessary, spending some budget on making that happen. So frequently for organisations of all sorts, they tend to equate our work with just mainstream media or sending out stuff to order, whether or not that stuff has a purpose or an outcome. If you take a look at some of the social media channels for organisations, for example, you'll see that many of them are still using it as broadcast, which is really a missed opportunity, as it gives a chance for organisations to build the critical relationships that they need with their stakeholders and communities. So first, some context, potentially. There we go. In order to implement a really effective research, measurement and evaluation program, we have to understand what it is we actually do. Often, as I said, PR is reduced to a whole bunch of tactics, media releases, social posts, events, and so on. And the reality is that PR builds and sustains the relationships that we need to maintain our license to operate. The things that we do, the tactics that are employed, form part of that end goal, but they're really not the end goal in themselves. Nobody works in isolation, and in order to do what we do, we have those critical relationships with customers, voters, suppliers, employees, shareholders, and many more besides. If one or more of those groups withdraws from the relationship, then our license to operate, our permission to operate and do what we do, is withdrawn and we cease to be. Our business closes down, our party is voted out of office, our departments restructured, with jobs lost and services reduced. Accepting that the relationship is at the heart of our work makes everything very easy to measure and evaluate. For those who like numbers and dollar figures, we can demonstrate the value to the organisation of our work in those terms, but we can also demonstrate, which is more important, how we've contributed to the organisational outcomes, and we can demonstrate how our activities have contributed to the accumulation of social capital or enhanced reputation for the organisation. And if we don't utilise an effective research, measurement and evaluation process, then we have no way of knowing if we've fulfilled our purpose or demonstrated the difference our work makes. So here's a PR atom that I put together a while ago, and I put it together to try and highlight where the things that we do fit together. And at the heart of it is the relationship. And you'll see around the outside of that central element that there's trust, satisfaction, loyalty, commitment, mutuality, and reputation. And those are the relationship components that we will be working on in the course of our daily activities. We'll be trying to improve trust, improve satisfaction, and so on. If you look to the other elements there, you'll see that there's communication, oral, written, visual, and experiential, and they're the areas of communication that we're involved with. We also have understanding and behaviour. Together, all of those things support the work that we do in order to make a relationship active, vibrant, and help us to sustain that license to operate. And if you look to the communications element there, there's one little bit of that which is written. And sadly, over the years, we've become most associated with that tiny little element of the broader work that we undertake. And so the written communication has tended to be the thing that people have focused on to try and measure, not necessarily to evaluate, but just to say, we've done X, we've done Y. So let's have a look at why we should be measuring, bearing in mind that at the heart of what we do is the relationship, keeping those licenses to operate intact and using those other elements to support that work. So why should we measure? Actually, we've got a duty to do so. And it's been, as I say, a botched part of the job in the past, but there's no room for botching it anymore. We need to know whether we've achieved our outcomes and report back on our endeavours. And this simple action helps our organisations and others understand the value and the nature of the work that we do. Many professionals just get stuck in this never-ending loop of sending out stuff, never knowing if the work that they do has any effect. Historically, organisations send out stuff that's instructional, or because they thought they should, or because that's the way hierarchical organisations operate. I've encountered many organisations, for example, where the public relations division or consultancy is given key performance indicators based on their outputs, the things that they do, rather than the effect those things might have. So they might be judged on, say, the number of media releases out the door in any one day, rather than the result of that work and the actions taken by stakeholders and communities in response. Research, measurement and evaluation is a complete process that looks beyond daily outputs. It analyses data, interprets measures, and guides an organisation's approach to strategic public relations and communications management. This brings me to the old chestnut that you can't measure PR. This argument generally revolves around, oh, it's intangible, it's too hard, or you just can't tell. On intangibles, it's actually worth noting that the intangible asset measures assigned by big corporations is significant. For example, the value of Coca-Cola's customer relationships in their published figures was set at 392 million at the 31st of December last year, with the other intangibles owned by the organisation making up the vast majority of their assets. We can measure and evaluate everything we do, and to drop in one of my favourite quotes, the single problem with communication is the illusion it's taken place. What we do matters, so measure it, report it, and carry on producing results. Accurate research, measurement, evaluation guides our strategy and lets us know when we need to change course, rather than having to take on a sharp and unexpected bend. Another point to consider is the difference between measurement and evaluation, and this becomes particularly pertinent when we're talking about reporting results. Measurement's a unit. That's, how long is a piece of string? It goes from here, it goes to there. but an evaluation will provide you with the significance of the outcome. So I've used a piece of string, it was 10 centimetres long, but was it the right string for the job? Would an elastic band have been better, or should I have really put my hand in my pocket and gone out and got some shoelaces? So make the difference in your mind between a measurement and evaluation. A measurement is indicative and an evaluation guides. For commercial organisations, the general proof of success is the health of the bottom line, the financial results. For governments and not-for-profits, the value of the services provided, along with cost and efficiency measures, are used. So I just wanted to highlight some of the things that organisations generally will look at to measure their performance, and then we'll look very specifically at PR and communication. The first one on here that you may be familiar with is the Net Promoter Score. So the NPS is a scale that ranges from -100 to 100, and it measures a customer's willingness to recommend a company's product or services to others. It's generally used for gauging satisfaction and loyalty, and it's predominantly a customer-focused measure that really gives priority to satisfaction. Key performance indicators, you'll be very familiar with those. They're widely used, and they're a simple target setting measure. So, for example, a sales KPI may be selling 100 saucepans a week to a restaurant. But the trouble with KPIs is that they can lead to employees working to specific measurements at the expense of the quality of work. For public relations and communications professionals, KPIs are really quite dangerous in some ways, as they tend, as I mentioned before, to be assigned purely to outputs, the things that we do. So, for example, that common PR KPI, the number of media releases issued in a week, or the number of social posts. This is misguided, and that's not because, or not just because professionals can produce content till the cows come home. We're really, really good at producing content. The real measure is to look at the result of that content, what it's achieved, rather than focusing on just sending out the things in themselves. GDP, the measure that's used globally to measure country performance. Gross domestic product, a measure of the market value of all goods and services provided in a given period. The estimates are used to judge economic performance, but increasingly questions are being asked about its effectiveness as a measure. You might be making lots of things, but it doesn't reflect how well your country is performing in terms of the health, happiness, and security of its citizens. The World Happiness Index is an interesting alternative that's gained considerable traction in recent years. It ranks 155 countries by happiness based on social foundations of the country in question, and gives a much better indicator of how well a country is performing in terms of the well-being of its people. Societal return on investment, SROI, that's the benefit and value to society of the work undertaken. So this might, for example, cover the value that you would attach to the prevention of some health conditions or other behaviours, and also results-based analysis, RBA, which focuses entirely on whether a programme has achieved what it set out to achieve and the outcome, which is really where most of our efforts should also rest. There are other methods of seeing how we're doing out there, including the balanced scorecard approach, but a more recent development which I'd urge you all to investigate further is the International Integrated Reporting Initiative. And this initiative hopes to change the way businesses and organisations around the world report their success. Integrated reporting doesn't look at financial success. It examines the value an organisation creates over time, and this is where we come in. It includes measures on societal, environmental and community impact. How well the organisation communicates with its stakeholders is a fundamental part of IR. And so it's a shift away from traditional financial reporting. A number of organisations around the world tested the whole process a couple of years ago, and I know that there were some New Zealand organisations involved in that testing. So it takes a more holistic approach, and it looks at the organisation's entire operations. But particularly for us, it looks at those areas where there is a significant community impact and whether or not we're communicating well with the stakeholders that give us our licence to operate. So, what about PR and communications management? I'm going to try really, really hard not to rant and rave at this point, but how do we get measured and reported? As I mentioned before, we've had a pretty checkered history, largely due to the way others have interpreted or framed what we do. For a long time, the visible end result of our work tended to be viewed as media relations. Organisations wanted their name in the paper, or not, as the case may be, and believed this to be the end game. For many years, PR departments were offshoots of advertising agencies, and chiefly as a result of this bizarre, spurious measure of advertising value equivalent came into being, along with others, but AVR has been the one that's really stuck around a bit like glue. Now, the upside of this is some people haven't encountered advertising value equivalence, which is absolutely marvellous, but I imagine you will come across it at some point. If you haven't encountered it, it's a nonsense measure, and it suggests that editorial achieved by an organisation is worth X number of dollars based on the cost of purchasing the same amount of space for an advert. Why is it nonsense? Because those column inches or airtime moments could contain all sorts of dreadful coverage or commentary, encouraging a bad reputation or sparking a crisis, in real terms, creating negative value, not a fabricated achievement of dubious worth. The trouble with AVE is it's a bit like measuring apples and elephants and comparing them. You can't measure two things that are completely different. Advertising is something that's paid for, chunk of stuff taken out, there you go, job done. Editorial coverage was the thing that was most associated with public relations and communication. So it's the old analogy of the swan paddling like crazy under the surface, but all you see on top is the lovely gliding along creature, making everything seem smooth and unruffled. But editorial coverage is not the sole purpose of what we do. If you think back to that atom, it's that little written bit at the top, and that's what people could see. That was the visible part. So the AVE is a measure that really doesn't work, and it doesn't work for anybody. Thankfully, there have been a number of steps and attempts to try and say to people, look, just don't use this. You're making yourself look daft. In 2010, the use of AVE as a so-called measure for PR was discredited by a coalition of global associations representing the profession, the measurement industry, which is AMEC, and other interested organisations. And what was put together then, because the meeting was held in Barcelona, was the Barcelona Principles. And what the Barcelona Principles did was put together 7 steps, if you like, that suggested this is what we should be doing. So in 2010, the importance of goal setting and measurement, measuring the effect on outcomes is preferred to measuring outputs. The effect on business results can and should be measured. Media measurement requires quantity and quality. AVEs are not the value of public relations. So that was the first time the world stood up and said out loud, actually, can we just stop? Okay, that is enough. In 2015, they revisited what the steps might be. And as you can see there on the IPR infographic that we've got here, that they've changed them a little bit, but there we go. AVs are not the value of communications, still there at number 5. It would be nice to see it at number 1, but really I hope it disappears off there altogether because nobody will use it anymore. AMEC, which is the Association of Measurement and Evaluation Companies, is currently running a Say No to AVEs campaign. And if you like, you can go and download a logo and put it somewhere so that people can see it. And I thought I'd pull out some quotes for you on the subject of APEs. And this is the IPR, which is the Institute of Public Relations in the States. And they say, most reputable researchers view such arbitrary weighting schemes aimed at enhancing the alleged value of editorial coverage as unethical, dishonest, and not at all supported by the research literature. And CIPR, which is Chartered Institute of PR in the UK, anyone attempting to use them, brackets AVEs, today is fooling themselves, fooling their clients, and failing the profession. AVEs have no place in modern professional PR practice. And PRCA added AVEs measure absolutely nothing other than the vanity of those reporting them. And finally, AMEC, by working with partners around the world, AMEC's committed to long-term campaign to eradicate this meaningless metric and educate professionals on better and available alternatives. So there's a lot of thinking happened around it, but there is absolute recognition that to try and equate an apple and an elephant in the measurement field is doing everybody a disservice. And it's something that as professionals, we really need to consider what we do and how we do it. So, what do we do instead? That's always the answer. There's a lot we can do instead, and many organisations, and I have to say this now, is although AVE still exists, the majority of organisations have matured and they've moved on to different measures and different means of assessing value. But for those who are still focused on media relations as the end game, they really do need to consider how they're approaching their measurement, because news has migrated elsewhere. And we look for information from a wide variety of sources on a number of different devices. So the news is most likely to find you based on your preferences, and that's going to arrive on your wearable device or your phone. But it's not the news that we measure and evaluate. As I said, it's the relationship that's at the heart of what we do, and that's what we must measure. A mainstream media relations program could form part of the strategic plan, but it's not at the heart by any means. Particularly when you think about engagement with mainstream news disappearing in the flames of fake news and media moguls as commercial entities. And we tend to get our information directly from the organisations that interest us now. We have patterns of behaviour. We're either going to want to know something, we're going to want to buy something, or we're going to want to do something. And we'll go to those organisations based on what we want to do, and also on the relationship that we have with them, whether we trust them, whether we understand them, and so on. Various adaptations of the media measurement model have been created, one of which is the PESO model, which looks at paid, earned, shared, and owned media channels. And as we've moved into the social area, things to measure came thick and fast, starting with follower numbers, moving into reach, shares, views, and so on. But once again, the measures themselves are not the end of the story. Just because somebody's retweeted your words or clicked onto your page doesn't mean to say that it's made the relationship stronger or your outcomes have been achieved. That action is not an end in itself. AMEC, as I mentioned before, has been working around measurements for many years, and initially when they were established they were about media measurement, but they've been looking at ways to increase the scope, and they recently introduced an integrated evaluation framework, which is well worth exploring as a guiding process for you if you're looking at refocusing and revisiting the way that you approach mainstream media. The other areas that you might be interested to look at in terms of measurement developments, the Reputation Institute regularly publishes a measurement index featuring some of the world's top companies and organisations, and it's based on who has the best reputation, how are people trusted, do they believe that the leadership is worthwhile, and so on. Consultancy Edelman produces the Edelman Trust Barometer, which measures our faith and trust in all manner of organisations. But again, reputation and trust are one part of the picture. So let's have a look to see some of the other things that we might be doing. News, as I say, is migrated elsewhere, and we're looking for information on a variety of sources and different devices. And the whole process has taken time. The whole process really needs to change. And the first thing that we need to do is determine what it is we can do to make those changes. So considering some first steps, the first one is looking at the things that we should be researching, measuring and evaluating. And I'm just going to have a quick slurp of water if you excuse me for a second. Okay, so it's long been agreed that there are two types of relationship. The first one is an exchange relationship, and the second one is a community relationship. Initial work on this topic in the public relations field was conducted by many scholars, but primarily PR scholars Grunig and Hahn, and they defined the relationships as falling into these two types. And at first sight, this is very straightforward. An exchange relationship involves money, so I buy something from you. And community is around societal good. You provide services for me, education, health, and so on. But exchange and community relationships are not always quite so clear-cut. So, for example, every employee is in an exchange relationship with their employer, even if the outcome, the work that's being done, is for societal good. So, how do you add tangibility to relationships? Some might say it will always be intangible, but broken into these component parts, it's easy to see how and where we can begin to measure. So the components are the same for both exchange and community relationships, and alongside the components set out by the scholars, I always add in a couple more that need to be considered. So Grünig and Hon's top 5, trust is the first one, mutuality, commitment, loyalty, and satisfaction. I add in understanding and reputation because without those two things, it makes it difficult, without those two things performing well, it makes it very difficult for a relationship to be initiated. If you think about your own relationships, you meet someone, you get to know each other, you find out more about each other's approaches and behaviours, and then you progress to a different stage of the relationship where you'll encounter trust, loyalty to the other person, satisfaction in their company, and so on. The same can be applied to organisational relationships, whether you're a charity, government department, small business just starting out on your journey. When we look at our organisational relationships, we start to measure the various components. Your initial research should question the health of each aspect. Do your stakeholders trust you? Is your relationship mutually beneficial? And if not, does each party accept a state of non-mutuality? So, for example, with my phone service provider, the fees that they charge may not be beneficial to my pocket, but the fact that they offer a stable connection or reliable speeds or an extra lump of data once in a while doesn't make the relationship an equal one in terms of exchange, but I'm happy to accept the higher fees in exchange for improved service. So you can have a relationship that's not entirely balanced and mutual, but there's an acceptance of those things. You have a similar situation when you're looking at risk and issues. What's an acceptable risk and what's a risk that can be mitigated? So we can look into commitment too. I'm happy to stay in this exchange relationship, or do I want to leave because it's not mutually beneficial or I'm not satisfied with the service? In terms of a community relationship, I may be dissatisfied with, say, the local health service provision. So when elections are held, I'll vote for those who will provide a better service. And your research into each of these relationship components will allow you to establish a benchmark against which you can evaluate the success of your campaigns and programs. And one of the problems has been in the past, again, is that people have considered that research as a pre-program, post-program component is something that's out of reach because we've been operating on that shoestring for a long time. Small departments, no budgets, just the fact that you're there is going to get something done. But there are many tools out there that can help us with good post and evaluative research for our programs. Without that, without knowing who we are, what we're doing, where we're going, how we're going to get there, we can't begin to establish a framework that's going to let us know not just when we've arrived, but also what we're going to do when we get there. So the other thing to consider when we're thinking about our work and the work of our organisations is we need to consider the value of the work that we provide to society, to our communities, to our customers, to our businesses. Monetary value comes in many forms: the value to the employee of a wage and a stable job, the value to the customer of the goods and services they provide in exchange for money, the value of the donor dollar to a charity or a not-for-profit organisation, and societal value obviously has an equal place and cost. The societal value of education, good health provision, adequate housing are all recognised, but often value means different things to different people. The images here, saffron, gold, a priceless instrument, and the concept of knowledge and learning, all of them represent something of value, yet all of them will be of differing value for you depending on your own beliefs and values, the things that you hold dear. So when we're thinking about what's next, we have to, as part of our research, determine what's the dollar value to our organisation or what's the societal value. Does it have to be one or the other? Sometimes it's both. Just, pause for a moment and think about the dollar value of failure of trust in your organisation. What's the dollar value of a loss of reputation, loyalty or satisfaction? And another consideration is what's the cost of not doing the work that you do? What happens to organisational and stakeholder relationships if, for example, a consultation isn't conducted properly, or if there's nobody to turn to for information during a crisis, or there's nobody available to communicate with employees during times of change? Calculating both the dollar and societal cost of not building and sustaining relationships, or the cost of ineffectual communication, is the sum that every practitioner should do. So this is all very well, and I know that those who use AVE will want to know what else they should be doing. And another popular question is that the board, the management team, whoever it might be, actually likes AVEs. They like getting them. So I will tackle that one first. Give them some real measurements as part of a considered evaluation of the work that you do. Explain that AVE is an outdated measure, present them with the results that show your work's delivering to outcomes that support the business and organisational outcomes, and you'll find that pretty soon they'll stop worrying about AVE and stop asking for it. And at the heart of our research, measurement and evaluation, is the relationship, and its component parts are the ones that we should measure. But when we start off with our research, we have to determine who are we talking to, who are the people that really do hold that licence to operate, who are the people who are critical to the organisational relationships. Establishing and identifying those communities, knowing how that they work with, for, and often against your organisation are really priority areas to equip you with the information that you need to progress. So when we're thinking about what's next and where we are, we need really to reflect on the things that we need to undertake to help us keep on track. When any organisation is developing a strategy, you have to determine your outcomes. Where is it you're going and why? And who are the people that we need to engage with as part of our journey to get there? And an effective PR and communication strategy is going to first support those organisations' outcomes by looking at the areas that need to improve. So when we move into some terms around this process, we need to look first at the outcome. And outcomes, I find, fall quite comfortably into 4 areas. So at the heart is the relationship and those components that we've talked about, but also an outcome for a program or for a campaign can cover these other areas: knowledge, behaviour and attitude. And I've found historically that where organisations have been reluctant to look at the relationship because it's beyond their thinking, helping them to determine what's the knowledge outcome of the program that you need, what behaviours do you need to address, and what attitudes are there. Areas. Sorry, I was distracted there because in the room next door to where we're doing the webinar, they're having a great time. So there's sudden bursts of laughter coming through. And if you can hear them, it's not us, it's next door. They're having very good outcomes in there by the sound of things. So the attitudinal outcomes, for example, tend to be aligned with reputation. So if I have a perception of an organisation being untrustworthy, your work may be designed to change my attitude by demonstrating the organisation's trustworthy based on existing or changed behaviours. So, for example, after the 2008 financial crisis, there were some very entrenched attitudes formed around the perceptions of trust in financial institutions, and that perception of trust plummeted to an all-time low. On the behavioural front, behavioural outcomes cover both the organisation and our stakeholders. We may have an internal behavioural outcome we need to achieve, for example, making sure our staff are properly trained and equipped to help our customers, or it could be that we need our stakeholders to do something, so stop smoking, exercise, drive more slowly. Knowledge outcomes cover the information and stories that we need to share about our organisation so people understand who we are. So that's the understanding component of the relationship. So who we are, what we do, what we stand for, and how we're of service to them. And that can be whether that service is making and providing jelly beans or ensuring the bus and trains run on time. And when we think about the breaking down of those outcomes, the areas that we need to look at for measurement is outputs. That's the what we do. That's the stuff that we get out the door. The outtakes is have people heard. So have they seen and understood, and perhaps they've reshared the information that we've provided for them, or they've taken another action as a result. And then your objectives will be your roadmap for getting you from where you want to, well, where you are now to where you want to be. And there's the process. It's a loop. It's research, set your outcomes, determine your objectives, head into implementing your program by getting your outputs, your tactics done and out the door. Outtakes, that's where your measurement units come in. You know, have people engage with the material that we've provided with them? Have they taken the actions that we want? That takes us to outcomes, which in turn takes us back to research. And the research that we do post-program allows us to pull together a decent evaluation against which we can report to our organisation. This loop was something that was determined and framed by the CIPR in the UK over 20 years ago, I would say. And it's a process that you might, as an individual practitioner, come into an organisation and meet any one point of that. But it should allow you to look at what's happening and then make the changes that are necessary to either adjust your program to get you to your outcomes, to allow you to evaluate and report back. Okay, so the journey metaphors tends to be a bit overworked, but in this case, it's a pretty pertinent one. If I start out on a journey, say I'm going to Hamilton, I need to assess not just why I'm going, but what resources I have, what I'll do when I'll get there, the purpose of my journey, and the purpose will determine the resources I need to allocate to the trip, the means of travel I need to consider, and so on. But if I don't know my starting point, am I leaving from home or a friend's house, I can't begin to determine the resources I need, the direction I need to take, or the transport I will choose. Your research is your starting point for any activity, and you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been or where you are now, not just where you're going, but what is it you want to do when you get there, okay? So with these things in mind, there's the 5 steps here that we all need to take towards effective research, measurement and evaluation. So determine the outcomes you want to achieve, relationship, behaviour, attitude and knowledge. Then look at the objectives you need to set. These need to be SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and timely, although realistic and timely is often interchanged with relevant and time-bound. Outputs are the things that we do, and they'll have a reason tied to the objectives that we've set. Outtakes tell us if, along the way, people have heard and understood what we're doing. And to help us measure this, we can use content analysis, focus groups, survey, all manner of measures which we'll look at as we go through. Outcome values help guide us. It's our license to operate intact. Do we know the value we're creating for our people and our communities? So when you're thinking about the things to do, don't get trapped into tactics. I often think back to somebody I worked with once, and we used to equate just the sending out of stuff continually as being trapped on a hamster wheel, where you're just going round and round and round, you come off for a bit, and then suddenly you're back on there. If we're just trapped into a loop of sending out stuff, then we'll never know whether or not the work that we're doing is making any difference. Your SMART objectives give you a simple framework that allows you to measure what you're doing. So don't get stuck on the hamster wheel and think about ways of scoring what you do. Just going to have a little sip of water. Hold on a second. So here's a relationship progress measure that you may want to consider using. When you start with your research, it will allow you to create a benchmark that will map your relationship progress. So if you look at this chart here, you'll see that a perfect relationship has a nice round score of 100. Yeah, and wouldn't that be lovely? But no relationship is perfect, and every relationship is different. And different components will be more important to one organisation than they are to another. So in this example, the floating 20, if you like, or higher scores have been assigned to satisfaction and community understanding. And it may be that when you look at your relationship with your stakeholders, there are other components in there that are important to you that you want to give a priority to, and that's fine. One of the things that's often asked, and I've been asked many times over the years, is, can you just give us a template? Can you just give us a magic bullet that's going to solve all this? There are processes and measures and plans that you can follow, but every time you do this, even within your own organisation, there's going to be a variance of data, there's going to be a variance of value, and there's going to be a variance of priority. So the beauty of it is that you can adapt it to make sure that it's fit for your purpose rather than trying to roll out something that was designed for mine. So your baseline research is going to give you a component score and the total relationship score from which you can determine where the areas of priority need to be when setting your objectives. So in this instance, the research has shown satisfaction and community understanding need to be improved. Post-program measurement allows you to see whether you've achieved that improvement, and in this case, satisfaction's improved, but community understanding still has some way to go. It's extremely unlikely that your organisation would achieve the perfect 100 because no organisation or individual is perfect. But what you have to decide together is where on the scale does your relationship need to be to maintain your licence to operate and build the social capital that you need to weather any kind of crisis or emergency. And how do you measure each component? Grunig and Hahn established a number of base questions that can be used, but generally I tend to devise my own depending on the nature of the work that's being undertaken. But the surveying, the questioning, the focus groups, the measures are generally taken using a simple Likert scale for each relationship component. And whilst you've got different ways of calculating the averages, my preference tends to be for the mode result, because mode is the most frequent value in a set of data. So I opt for the most data around the relationship score. So if most people are saying, I don't trust you, then I would really like to know at that point. So there's a couple of examples here that I've put together just to give you some indication as to how this works, how it translates into some kind of reality, how it acts as a guidance tool for you at the beginning and at the end of your program. So this one is just a not-for-profit organisation, needs to raise funds for its charitable works, and as an example here, what they're going to do is, the previous difficulties have led the organisation with a lack of stakeholder trust, a poor reputation, and very low recognition when it comes to people in wider society understanding what they do. So research has been done, the baseline score has been established, and as you can see, the programme needs to improve trust, reputation, and knowledge of benefits to society. So you've got a starting point as to where you need to go. You can then devise your strategy, develop your creative, implement your campaign, roll out your tactics, and monitor those as you go with measurements of data and so on, which we'll have a quick glance at the moment. I'm conscious of the time. And we will then be able to do the post-program research, which gives us an indication as to how the relationship's improved. This one is for a brand, and again, once the research has been done, you'll see that the program design needs to concentrate on a behavioural outcome, improving commitment and satisfaction, loyalty as well. And it also requires an internal communications program to address employee engagement skills. So your pre-program research, your base research, really does give you a guidance as to how you then go on to support your organisation. And again, another devised example for you that gives you an indication as to the pre and post value of the research. What you're trying to look at and address here is how do we, as public relations and communications professionals, support the organisational outcomes through our PR and communications outcomes so that what we do together is delivered to the people that we serve. And anything that we do via our PR and communications work has to absolutely support those organisational outcomes. It doesn't need to be or to be undertaken in a siloed or disjointed manner. And figure out that cost, figure out the value of erosion of trust and reputation, or what's the cost if legislators take action, or an organisation's disbanded, or those receiving help are cut loose. Those sorts of figures, those sorts of values are the areas that you need to determine when you're in your initial planning processes. So what can we use to measure that bit of string as we go along? There's a number of tools at our disposal now which make it a lot easier. I tend to suggest start with the analytics and the data that you have within your organisation to determine not just your communities, but their behaviours, their interactions with you, and also what do you know about them, so that when you're trying to discern the correct communications channel, you're able to place it for them in the places that they like to go. So use your analytics, track your different outputs, and if it's written outputs, you can track it through data analysis, content analysis. There's some great tools out there like Lexalytics, which will give you sentiment analysis, detailed content analysis, favourability, and so on. Look to see what conversation shares are happening, how many people are talking about a particular subject. If it's Game of Thrones, it's off the chart. You can't move without a dragon coming out to bite you on the ear. But those areas that we are considering also need to include those people who are, excuse me one moment, those people who are using our services. So what's their user behaviour? If you look at your analytics programs, for example, Google Analytics, you'll be able to determine your audience interactions. You'll be able to assign a lifetime value of visitor now within there. You'll be able to have goal conversions that you can use to help track. You'll be able to determine the social flow of your communities and individuals as they come through from your various social channels into your site and out again. Bounce rates, length of time on page. There's a phenomenal amount of information that you can gather that you can then put together and analyse, so you'll have a whole picture of what's happening. Because that whole communication, the illusion that it's taken place, one of the things that we have to recall is that we need to make sure we remove single action bias. And single action bias is the belief that we do something once and that means that the outcome's been achieved. But if we're thinking about communication, things always go in threes. So if my friend, for example, and she and I haven't spoken for a while, I send her a Christmas card. That doesn't mean to say that our relationship is active and engaged. I might then follow up and send her some chocolates, which is great. She puts them under the tree. But the thing that does it in the end is the third action, which prompts her to do something. And I remember how many laughs we've shared. So I send her a dancing elf Christmas card, and that then makes her contact me, and we are engaged once more. And that process follows into the work we do. And this little framework gives you an indication as to some of the measures that you can use, particularly in the online sphere. So you've got those three stages of the relationship. So the hello, the content that helps your community user understand more, the measures, and the next space on, which will give you the varying interval reward ratio, which is something that I'm happy to talk about in more depth with you, but it can take some time to go. But as an engagement process, we'll give a reward to those people that we are talking with. Next phase, let's talk. Next phase, let's do. And if you're still hung up on measuring traditional media, don't be. Make media relations programs part of your overall communication strategy. where it's identified as a valid community of action. And that's something to consider. Are the relationships good with the mainstream media, traditional media engagements that you're trying to progress, or are you doing it as a one-off? A one-off doesn't work. So if you want to analyse your traditional media coverage, there's some great smart artificial intelligence-driven programs out there that can give you detailed content analysis. You can go old school and do the content analysis in the same way that we've done for many years, which is scoring the content, its relevance and so on, but also determining the length of and duration of the relationship with the journalist that's involved. This is the snapshot of the integrated evaluation framework that I mentioned before. And as you can see, it follows a flow of aligning objectives, implementation, measuring activity, response and effects, and so on. So if you wanted to dig into that a little bit further, then you'll be able to access that through the AMEC site. FPRINZ also has for you, and for some time now, we've had a measurement section on the website, which again will guide you through the process. The main thing is to actively look at your RME process in the same way as you be revisiting your communication strategy over a period of time. It has to be an integral part of that framework, and something that you look at regularly. So that brings us to the end of this very fast overview of RME, and now it's over to you, really. Some questions and thoughts. I don't know if we've had any questions in, Rhianna, if anybody's raised anything.
No, not yet. So if you have any questions for Catherine, feel free to just type them in your sidebar now, and we will just try and answer them.
We have had one question. Did the piece of string actually match the colour of my shoes, more importantly? And yes, that would be an important part of the evaluation. When you're reporting results, well, I don't know if you're having some thinking time. When you're reporting results, think about the format that you hand those over in. If, for example, your organisation is still looking at you to just report the output, so, we've sent out X number of this and we've done this number of that, tie it back to the smart objectives that you have. So, for example, in quarter one or week one or month one, we sent out this, we had this media engagement, we had our revamp of our website and so on. Tie that back so that you can say, we did this so that we were able to engage with our stakeholder community, number one. We held this event so that we could have some face-to-face interaction with our priority community, number two. We held this other occasion so that we could really determine how far our brand understanding had reached the communities of interest for our organisation. So there's a number of ways of tying your activities back if you're having to approach this programme in research. So, who's doing measurement and evaluation well in New Zealand or anywhere? I'm not dodging the question when I say lots of people are. In terms of government, there's been a shift in government and not-for-profit to looking at the SROI, the societal return on investment. And for brands, there's a great deal more time and devotion given to looking at the brand relationship and understanding. I'm not dodging the question, but I can't put my hand on my heart and give a concrete example at this stage. So I will have a think and I will try and compile a compendium of excellence. But I think one of the things you could do is some of the FPRINZ Award case studies, there are some really good examples there of measurement well done and evaluation well done. And I would commend off the top of my head the Supreme Award winner, Campbell Squared, for their, the whole programme was brilliant, but the evaluation was particularly well thought out. So, another question.
Next question. For those working in local government communication, how do you suggest carrying out baseline measurements in your surveys?
Yeah. Annual surveys are good. It can Annual surveys are good, but you might need to have a little bit more. If you focus the surveys on particular communities of interest, that can deliver more useful and pertinent information. Focus groups are good. Quickfire polling can help as well. But the main thing is to look to discern who are the communities of interest. I know when we're talking about local government communication, it tends to be looked at a very broad level. So we're looking at everybody within our area, but it's understanding what we need to find out from each of those stakeholder groups within the community so that it becomes a community consultation and research that can inform the real feeling amongst your stakeholders as opposed to a more general touch point. So surveys, focus groups, fine. Some kind of interactivity. It might be that you deploy a chatbot or something to engage with people so that you can gather information that way, and it gives you a more continual touchstone to work with than just a one-off at one point in the year.
Another question, is it a good idea to pay an external company to carry out annual surveys? First to provide a baseline and then to compare in following years. Good spend of comms budget?
I think it's going to depend on the size and the scope of your organisations. And I know for research companies around the world, they'll be really happy to say, yes, go out there, go spend your money. It may be that it's something that you can execute yourself, but before you either do it yourself or you engage somebody to do it for you, I would make sure that you're really clear about the organisational outcomes, organisational values, the PR outcomes that you need to support that, so that you've got something to go out there and ask questions about. Because often when we're looking in the mirror, we see the thing that we're accepting. You know, I'm getting older now, and I still feel the same as I did when I was much younger. But I look in the mirror, and the mirror gives me a different picture. When we're inside an organisation, we don't always have the same picture as our external community. So without knowing where we are and what we want to achieve, it can be quite difficult to discern that. An external company can help you to get there because perhaps, you know, they're that outside voice, but they have to be able to work to a really good brief that you need to be in a position to provide.
And do you have a recommendation for social tracking?
Oh, I've got heaps. I've got lots. I mean, there's lots and lots of things out there. One of the things that I could perhaps do is stick a list up for you to access. But I mean, there's truckloads of stuff out there that you can utilise. And I know that doesn't answer your question precisely, but it's also a horses for courses thing. What is it you want to track? I mean, everybody should have some kind of social tracking dashboard up, whether it's Hootsuite or Sprout Social or Social Bakers, doesn't matter which one it is. You need to have something as a practitioner and as a professional to track the information yourself. But there are so many out there. If you are on your own, you've got no budget, there's free stuff. And if you've got some money to spend, there's stuff you can pay for. So I can put some suggestions up there, but you would need to go and explore to find the one that best suits your purpose. Yes, can you send information about Lexalytics? No, I'll stick that on the list if that's any help. So how are we doing for time? I think we're just coming up to
one more question.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I do the in-house PR and have worked with agencies who still track ABE. Do you have a program / tool that I can use in-house to measure?
Right. I think I probably need a supplementary question from you there in terms of what is it you want to measure? Because if you're measuring, say for example, you're measuring media coverage, if they're presenting ABEs, look at that media coverage and say, right, what's the value of this coverage in terms of helping us to reach our outcomes? Has it been issued? Have we sent this out in order to change behaviour, attitude, knowledge, or improve the relationship? Has this done that in any shape or form? Yeah. So you need to have those things in place before you can start to visit the physical measurement of it. Does that make sense? So I'd need to know more about what you needed to measure, but I would say to them, stop giving me AVEs because they shouldn't. So one last one, or are we? I think we're just on our time together, aren't we? So,
Yeah, sure.
So I'd like to say thank you for spending some time with us today, and I'll hand you back to Rihanna, who I think will round us off. If you've got a question or if you want some pointers, you can always email me, and I'll see what I can do to help. But I will put that little list of stuff together, and hopefully that will be a useful resource for you. And we'll put it onto the measurement section of the FPRINZ website.
Yeah.
How's that? So that will be a good place to find it. Okay.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you to you all for attending today's webinar. Just as a note, so we have just confirmed our next webinar, which will be held on the 27th of September at the same time. So this will be with Sal Smutek on employee engagement, who will present her research, her MBA research on employee engagement and the VUCA world. So volatile, uncertain, complex, and, if I can just see it, and ambiguous. Also, so as I mentioned before, today's webinar was recorded and will be made available on our website tomorrow. I will also send out the slides and the link to the recording via email. So after the webinar has finished, a short survey will pop up. If you please take a moment to fill this out, we greatly appreciate your feedback and ideas on these webinars. All right, well, thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.